Welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and my guest today is Avi Bell, a professor at University of San Diego, as well as Bar-Ilan University, and an expert on international law. Thank you, Avi, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I have a number of things to talk about. I mean, obviously, what's been in the news lately has been everything about so-called annexation. Other people want to call it extending sovereignty. I believe you have a different term for it. What's your term for it?
My term has the virtue of being accurate, and what's being discussed is applying Israeli civilian law. And so that's what I call it, applying Israeli civilian law. Okay. If you want a one-word term, you can call it civilianizing.
Okay, so civilianizing parts of Judea and Samaria. So we've been hearing a ton about it, and again, people are calling it annexation, which is not accurate, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. And everybody seems to be getting it wrong, and not only the anti-Israel people, who you could assume are going to be using this to lie as much as possible, but and I'll bring it up right now. There was even an article in the Atlantic called "Annexation, Apartheid, and Me" by Hirsch Goodman, who's a longtime Jerusalem Post columnist, saying also that what Israel's about to do is very similar to apartheid. So the first major question for you, Avi, is what's happening? And I know you just started to explain it, but just go a little bit more.
Okay.
What is it?
All right. I'm going to want to say something about Hirsch Goodman's remarks in a few minutes, but let me first explain what it is before I get to tackling what it isn't. And so what's been discussed over the last several months has been a proposal that Israel will apply what is called its law administration and jurisdiction, that is, its civilian law, to parts of Area C in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, roughly half of Area C. And we'll do this in coordination with the United States so as to leave the way open, or perhaps even advance the possibility of a future peace agreement under the Trump plan. Now, that's the plan. Now, what does it mean to apply the law administration jurisdiction of the State of Israel? It means that the same civilian laws that apply in Israel, the land law, Clean Air Act, criminal law, any other law that you can think of, would apply in half of Area C of Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, the way it applies in Israel. That's the entirety of what's being discussed. Now, there are a number of dramatic results from this, ranging from the most basic things to how you get permits to operate a business, to being able to build a house, to the speed laws that apply in the highway, or the permits that apply for a factory. But sovereignty has nothing to do with any of them, and annexation has nothing to do with them. Now, the reason that sovereignty doesn't have anything to do with it, with what's going on, is for a very simple reason: that Area C of the West Bank is already under Israeli de facto sovereignty under the Oslo Accords, and it's under Israeli de jure sovereignty. As a result, this gets a little bit more complicated, but really, since Israel was founded in 1948, it has had lawful sovereignty over all of the area of the former mandate of Palestine. And so, to me, this has nothing to do with new claims of sovereignty. Israel already has it. It does not need to extend it anywhere. And what we're really talking about is what law will apply there. What legal regime will people live their lives under?
So you're saying that even from 1948 to 1967, when Jordan, even though most countries did not accept it, but even when Jordan was responsible or had taken over the legal responsibility for the area, you're saying even then Israel was the sovereign?
So yeah, now this is the reason I use the terms de facto sovereignty and de jure sovereignty. De facto sovereignty is a term that refers to who's in fact in charge. Right? It's not a question of whether they're legally entitled to be in charge, but whether they actually have the ability and run the place. Right now, Jordan conquered and illegally occupied the West Bank, what it called the West Bank, for almost 20 years, from 1948 to 1967. And there's no doubt that Jordan had de facto sovereignty then. Israel only acquired de facto sovereignty in 1967. But de jure sovereignty is a different matter. De jure sovereignty is a question of who has the legal entitlement to rule there. And the legal entitlement doesn't simply result from who's got the guns and the bayonets there. There are legal doctrines that tell us what state has the highest right, the highest legal right to exercise its authority there. And the rule that is generally applied to new states, it's a mouthful in Latin, but it's fairly easy to understand in practice. The doctrine is called uti possidetis juris. And what the doctrine means is that when new states come into existence, they get all of they get legal sovereignty, de jure sovereignty over all of the area of the previous administrative unit. So that means, for example, when the Ukraine became an independent state, it acquired territorial sovereignty, de jure sovereignty over all of the territory of the old Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, including Crimea. And that's why all the world went nuts when Russia took over Crimea. It's because under the doctrine of uti possidetis juris, Crimea was part of the Ukraine. It was part of the Ukraine because even if the majority of the population was Russian, it was part of the old administrative unit of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And there was only one state that emerged from the Mandate of Palestine. That was the state of Israel. And so Israel succeeded to sovereignty over all of the mandatory territory, including those parts that were illegally occupied by Jordan and Egypt. So what Jordan called the West Bank was part of Israel's legal territory from the very beginning.
Are you saying that this is true even though Israel did not assert a legal claim over that territory at the time?
Well, the doctrine doesn't require the state that gets sovereignty to assert anything whatsoever. It doesn't require it to actually have possession. It just says we take the old administrative lines and they become the new legal lines. And it's a well-accepted doctrine. It's been applied in Africa and South America and Asia, in Europe, and there's a reason for it. The reason is we don't want to get into border disputes. And so when the International Court of Justice explained why it was applying this doctrine in Africa into areas that had previously been under control of different states, where the majority population didn't necessarily agree with it, they said, we prefer this doctrine for reasons of avoiding war, even where it means it confounds claims of self-determination, even where it means that we're going to have to switch possession from one side to the other. And it's the same reason that it was applied in the former Yugoslavia and the former Soviet Union and the former colonies of Spain and Portugal and South America, and on and on and on and on. So no, Israel did not have to say anything, whether it said anything or not, and for the most part it didn't say very much. And whether Israel actually had possession the entire time is of no relevance. Israel had legal title from the very beginning.
So just to be clear, if the Arabs, the Palestinians, would have declared a state instead of Jordan taking it over, would that have changed things?
So if there had been a Palestinian Arab state in 1948, that would most definitely have changed things. But it wasn't simply a question of declaring it. In order for a state to exist under international law, it has to meet the 4 criteria that are called the Montevideo Criteria. Those are criteria that apply, that appear in a treaty that was signed in Montevideo, and they require that a new state have a permanent population, a government that controls territory, and the capacity to carry on foreign relations. Now, Israel had those met those conditions from the very beginning, and the Palestinians still don't meet those conditions. In fact, it's one of the funny things that has appeared in legal proceedings in the International Criminal Court. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court very much wants to support the claim of the Palestinians to be a state, but she says she's supporting them even though they don't meet the Montevideo criteria. They still don't, 72 years later.
Interesting. I think I've seen arguments. Otherwise, I think even Eugene Kantarovich has made that argument that they are considered that the Palestinian Authority, at least areas A and perhaps B are considered a state. So I'll let you argue that with him. But to go through the accusations that we're seeing from anti-Israel groups about what is imminent, what's about to go on, what they thought was going to happen July 1st, what the day of rage or the week of rage or the decade of rage is going to be. Is this apartheid?
Well, of course not. Apartheid isn't something that happens by accident. Apartheid is an intentional regime for the subjugation of a particular race. It's sort of what you see in the Palestinian Authority, where they have an entire legal regime that's designed to strip Jews of the ability to buy property or to own property, or to acquire citizenship and the like. That's apartheid, and that's intentional. With the claims that are made against Israel are that Israel is somehow going to accidentally end up being an apartheid state, which, by the way, is impossible, because the definition of apartheid requires that it be intentional. But somehow or another, Israel is going to accidentally end up in this scheme in which it's going to decide in the future that it wants to strip all its non-Jewish citizens of rights. Now, it hasn't happened in the past, and it's not going to happen in the future. The civilianizing of parts of Area C is not going to create an apartheid regime. It's going to give all the residents of the area, whatever their ethnicity, the same set of legal rights under Israeli law. And the accusation of apartheid is based, like also many other accusations against Israel, not based on what's actually happening, but based on these attributions of evil motives to the Jewish state, and then accusing Israel of being guilty of what the accusers are making up in their minds. So when Hirsch Goodman says it'll be apartheid if Israel strips all the Palestinian residents of affected areas of their rights, Israel's not going to do that. Nobody's discussing doing that. That there's no plan on the table for Israel applying Israeli law by ethnicity. It either be applied to an area or it will not. There's not a single proposal that I have seen to apply it ethnically rather than geographically. And so whether out of ignorance or mendacity, is creating a charge that really has no reflection in reality.
By your definition of and again, I won't try to pronounce it correctly, but uti posseditus iuris, wouldn't that strengthen the argument, though, that if Israel is both the de facto and the de jure sovereign over this area, that they do have two separate laws, one for citizens, one for actual citizens of Israel, and one for the non-citizens, who are the overwhelming population of the territories?
Well, Israel doesn't have de facto control over areas A and B of the West Bank. It doesn't because it has an agreement with the Palestine Liberation Organization going back to 1993, in which the Israel and the PLO agreed to split authority. Now, it is well known in the world that there are cases in which a state has de jure sovereignty, but it's unable to exercise de facto sovereignty. And so that's, for example, is the case in Northern Cyprus. The state of Cyprus has de jure sovereignty over Northern Cyprus, but Turkey has occupied Northern Cyprus for more than 40 years. And during that time, Cyprus has not been able to exercise de facto sovereignty. And there, it's well understood that you can't come to Cyprus and complain about the way that Turkey runs those areas. Now, I don't think that there's any grounds on which you can come to Israel and complain about the way the Palestinian Authority mistreats the residents of areas A and B. On the other hand, within Area C, up until now, what Israel has done is applied a military law. The military law applied to Israelis and to non-Israelis. And if this goes through, what we will see is that Israel will apply civilian law to Israelis and to non-Israelis. Now, if I had my druthers, I would see Israel apply its civilian law to all of Area C. I don't see any particular reason for Israel to carry on a continued military administration. But it's also clear, as you can see from the pressure around the world, that there are many people who call themselves human rights advocates who are insisting that Israel not grant the benefits of civilian law in Area C. I can't understand how they can justify this to themselves, but that's what they're demanding. And so we have to thank goodness for the small steps.
But aren't you, again, if Israel would extend sovereignty over the entire area, then we come up to the demographic issue, right?
Well, the demographics of Area C are that it is overwhelmingly a Jewish population. And it was set up that way. It was the Israel and the PLO, back when they set up areas A, B, and C in 1995, did so in order to give Israel primary jurisdiction in areas that were primarily Jewish, and to give the Palestinians primary jurisdiction in areas that were primarily Palestinian. And so if Israel applied its civilian law to all of Area C, it would be applying its law in an area which is overwhelmingly Jewish in population. And that, I don't think that you would change the demographic picture overall in any meaningful way, were Israel to civilianize all of Area C. As it is, the Trump plan envisions that additional parts of Area C will one day become a Palestinian state. And the Americans that are participating in the Joint Map Committee are trying to have Israel apply its Israeli law only in areas that are even more overwhelmingly Jewish, that is, to leave out as much as possible Palestinian areas for this future hypothetical Palestinian state. And so I can't see a situation in which there would all of a sudden be a revolution in the demographic picture of the state or of the Palestinian Authority, even if Israel were to civilianize the law of all of Area C.
Okay, I'm understanding your arguments. Clearly, most of the world doesn't accept that. Clearly, people are making very blanket statements, including jurists, including seemingly the ICC, including the UN, that what Israel is considering doing is definitely illegal. Is there any benefit to the legal argument if nobody's going to accept it?
I think that what we have to understand is what they're doing, what these opponents of Israel are doing when they make these arguments. What they're aiming to get to a certain result, and they're trying to rewrite the law on the fly to fit the result that they want. Right now, for the Palestinians, what they're interested in is in a result in which Israel has no rights. The Jewish people have no rights, in which the Jews have no right to self-determination. So they keep rewriting legal doctrines in order to fit that intended result. In, let's say, the more benign opponents of Israel in much of Europe, they imagine that there will be a peaceful resolution to the conflict when there's a state of Palestine that has territorial sovereignty over all of the areas that were illegally occupied by Egypt and Jordan between 1948 and 1967. They imagine that's the thing that's going to bring an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And because of that, they're rewriting international law around that. They're trying to say that anything that doesn't lead to that result violates international law. Now that's conclusory. Now the only way to get them to stop doing that is either to get them to recognize that perhaps their desired conclusion is unrealistic or unwanted, and there's no sign of that at the moment. And the other way is to get them to understand the damage they're doing to legal institutions by getting them to throw out the law and substitute these political opinions. But I don't see any likelihood of that happening either at the moment. And so, yeah, this is going to continue being a dialogue of the deaf. I will continue saying what the law actually is, and they will continue distorting it around where their politics are.
But what again? I mean, they're not talking about it right now specifically about that, but the ICC is dealing with what they call crimes that Israel has done right now. And they're trying to make sure that there are ways that this argument can be made. If the ICC rules, for example, and again, I don't think they're talking about this right now, but if they rule that this is annexation and it's illegal. It's the acquiring of territory by war, which is not legal under the UN Charter, and all this other sort of stuff, which is the sort of stuff we've been hearing. Does that have legal validity or not?
Well, the question is, do they have the ability to make the law? No, it's an institution that's interpreting the law as it will apply it within its institutions. And we know what the ICC is going to rule. This is not exactly a surprise. The ICC is a politically involved institution. It is a controversial institution because it's had so little success. And it's been seen as biased because it's so far brought all of its successful cases only against African defendants. The ICC desperately wants to have some non-African defendants that it can prosecute and convict that are not from funding states, and that means Israelis. And so the ICC, the bureaucracy, the prosecutor's office in particular, has been working with the Palestinians for more than a decade to cook up a legal framework for going after Israelis. And it's every step of the way has been documented. Where the Palestinians have fallen, the prosecutors come up with new legal theories for the Palestinians to try. And we know exactly where it's going to end up. And one of the things that the prosecutor's been pushing since the very beginning is the idea that all of the West Bank and East Jerusalem included, and all the Gaza Strip are Palestinian territory. And this is necessary for the prosecutor. The prosecutor, it's not enough for the prosecutor to say that there's a state of Palestine. I mean, the prosecutor needs for there to be a state of Palestine in order to have jurisdiction. But she doesn't want jurisdiction over Palestinians. She wants jurisdiction over Israelis. And having a Palestinian state is not enough for her to get jurisdiction over Israelis. So to get jurisdiction over Israelis, she needs a state party to have sovereignty over the territory where she wants to find the defendants. And that means she has to insist that there's a state of Palestine that has sovereignty over, for example, the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, because that's the way she can go after Israeli Jews in the Jewish quarter. And so this is not new. This has nothing to do with what she and others will call annexation. This is old. It's appeared in the documents she's filed before the court previously. We already know that the pretrial chamber will approve her request and find that all of these areas are territory of the so-called state of Palestine. And we know that at the end of this process, there will be charges against Israeli defendants, because what's determining this is not the law. What's determining this is the politics, and the politics are crystal clear.
Okay, that's not optimistic, but okay. Get that. Is there any incompatibility between what Israel is considering doing and the Trump plan?
Well, what Israel is planning to do is tailored to fit with the Trump plan, right? So the Trump plan is a very ambitious attempt to bring to a resolution the Israeli-Palestinian part of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and to do so by getting the Palestinians to give up terrorism, to recognize the rights of self-determination of the Jewish people, to recognize the Jewish state, to give up some of their more maximalist demands, and agree to a demilitarized Palestinian state on less than all of the territory that they want. Now, Israel is coordinating its moves with the Trump administration to not cross over into areas that the Trump plan hopes the Palestinians will say yes to a future state with. And so the Israeli actions are coordinated to make it possible for the Trump plan to work, but they aren't sufficient to make the Trump plan work. To make the Trump plan work, the Palestinians have to make some real changes. They have to agree to give up terrorism, and to agree to give up funding terrorism, and push the Hamas terrorist organization out of power in the Gaza Strip, and accept the Jewish right to self-determination. All these are things I think that the Palestinians will never say yes to, or at least none of the current leadership of the Palestinians will ever agree to. And so I think that the Trump plan is ambitious but unlikely to succeed. Nonetheless, Israel is doing its very, very best to give the Trump plan a chance to succeed.
What do you, I mean, this goes beyond the law, but what do you anticipate is going to happen next, both from the Israeli side, because obviously Israel has not made any moves yet, as well as from the Palestinian side?
I do think that in all likelihood, Israel will carry out the plan as it's discussed. I think that the holdup at the moment is the need to coordinate with the United States rather than any of the other factors, any of the other political factors. And so when that's worked out, and I think it is rightly very important for the government of Israel to make sure that it cooperates with the Trump administration. When that gets out of the way, I think that this will be done. As for the Palestinians, the Palestinian leadership, I think, will continue doing what it has been doing, which is it will continue to try to incite violence. It will continue to pretend that laws exist when they want them enforced against Israel and deny they exist when somebody wants them to abide by them. I think that they will continue to pay for terrorism and try to incite terrorism. They will make all sorts of bombastic announcements that will be nothing new, but I think that on the ground, the Israeli move is not likely to have any significant effect on the Palestinian leadership. As for what it will do with Palestinian citizens, I think that Palestinian citizens in the parts of Area C that are affected by the plan will be extremely happy. They will have access to Israeli national security payments, unemployment payments, Israeli labor law, and a whole host of other things that are missing for them right now. I think they'll be tremendously happy. I think that Palestinians just outside of those areas will try to move into those areas. And so I think you will see demographic pressures into the areas where Israel's created its civilian law. And I think that those areas that are completely ruled by the Palestinians, areas A and B, and of course the Gaza Strip, which is run by Hamas, are inherently unstable. They are being misruled. The subjects there are being abused by the Palestinian leadership. And I think that violence in those areas is just a matter of time, both against their Palestinian leaders and, of course, against Israel.
You mentioned about the demographics, and we know that even among and we don't know the exact number, 250,000, let's say, of the Palestinians that are in Area C, a lot of them are effectively illegal squatters. A lot of them have moved there specifically for demographic reasons, specifically at the behest of both the current and the previous Palestinian prime minister. Do you think Israel is going to be making moves to stop that from happening? Or is Israel going to look at individual cases and say, hey, you have a home in Area A, and this is not your real home, therefore you're not a resident? I mean, how do you think that's going to work out?
I honestly don't know what enforcement measures are going to look like. I will say this, the primary population pressure of Palestinians to this point has been into Jerusalem, because a Palestinian who can claim residence in Jerusalem is able to get the benefits of Israeli civilian law, including the welfare payments and the unemployment benefits and so on and so forth. And so is Israel applying its law to half of Area C? I don't think it's going to create demographic pressures. I think it's going to move them. So instead of Palestinians fighting to establish residence in Jerusalem, they're going to try to establish residence in other parts of Area C. And I actually think that'll make it an easier problem to tackle rather than a harder one.
Do you think, and going back to the previous question, do you think that the Palestinians are going to make good on their threats of a third intifada or ending the Oslo Accords altogether or any of that?
Well, the Oslo Accords one is actually a simpler one. The Palestinians have not abided by their side of the Oslo Accords almost since the beginning, and I don't know what it would mean for them to not abide by to newly fail to abide by the Oslo Accords. They have never abided by them. As for calling them off, they've already called them off a half dozen times. They've done it over the last several years. So it may be that they'll announce once again that they're not abiding by the Oslo Accords. And it certainly will be true that they're not going to abide by them. But I just don't know how we would tell the difference. Now, as far as the calls for violence, it's been a fairly consistent that both the Palestinian authorities both called for violence and tried to restrain it. It's called for violence because it's a way of directing frustration at Israel rather than the Palestinian leadership, and it's tried to restrain it because it's afraid that it will get out of hand, that it won't be able to control it, that the Palestinian leadership might end up itself being threatened. And I don't see that pattern is shifting very much. What I think is the great threat of violence in the Palestinian territories is nothing to do with Israel applying its law. It has to do with two things. First of all, the Palestinian Authority is under tremendous economic pressure. It's under tremendous economic pressure because of the pandemic, because it's lost funding, because it insists on continuing to pass along money to terrorists, and it's under economic pressure because of an extraordinary amount of corruption. And all this is creating a lot of frustration among ordinary Palestinians who are paying the price. The second factor that's pushing towards violence is the aging of the Palestinian leadership, and in particular Mahmoud Abbas, who is eventually going to pass from this world. I mean, it's quite an achievement to be 15 years into his 4-year term. And I suppose that he would like to carry that on to 20 and even 25 years into his 4-year term. But eventually, the 4-year term is going to end, not because of the passage of time, but just because nobody lives forever. And there will be a scramble to take over the Palestinian Authority money when he passes away. So there are factors here that are pushing towards violence. They don't have anything to do with Israel applying its law, and I don't know when it'll be, if it'll be tomorrow or if it'll be 5 years from now. But it's hard to see this as a stable situation.
One of the threats that I believe Saeb Erekat made is that, and this threat's been made before, but this was more specific, saying that the Palestinian Authority would dissolve itself. Israel will become responsible for the garbage collection and all of Gaza and all of areas A and B, and all of the little things that are now being done effectively by the Palestinian Authority. I'm skeptical. What do you think?
It's clearly nonsense. First of all, Saeb Erekat can say whatever he wants, but he's not going to get Hamas to hand over its weapons to Israel and invite Israel to take over. That's just never going to happen. Right? Hamas is not voluntarily going to give up power. And frankly, in areas A and B, particularly in Area A, in the large Palestinian cities, Saeb Erekat may like to bluff, but most people there, especially those sitting on lots of cash, are not so eager to turn over their enterprises to Israel. So I just don't see this as a very likely outcome. I think that it's an attempt to speak to a certain part of the Israeli society which is panicked about the idea of permanent rule over the Palestinians. And I can understand why they're panicked about it. The fact that it's the Palestinians that are threatening this rather than the government of Israel should tell you about who it is that actually wants this, right? There's nobody in the Israeli government that's saying, we're going to come in and overthrow everything and take over garbage collection, right? It's not an Israeli threat.
Do you see any, or do you have any worries about Europe, whether the EU as a whole or individual nations in Europe, starting to implement sanctions or that sort of thing as a result of these moves?
Well, Europe has been implementing slow-rolling sanctions against Israel for years, and you can see them in all sorts of things. Right? It starts, with customs treatment. Right, the European Union has for years given adverse customs treatment to Israeli goods that are from over the Green Line, that are from East Jerusalem or the West Bank, right? And that's not going to change. Large parts of Europe have adopted discriminatory labeling requirements for Israeli products from those areas. There are units of the European Union that have refused to accept export certificates for Israeli products from over the line. And so all these kinds of sanctions are already in place. And if you look at the EU reports, in particular the reports of EU diplomats that are leaked to the press every year, you can see that there's a whole series of sanctions that anti-Israel hardliners in the EU have been pushing for years. Sanctions against Israeli banks, sanctions against Israeli Jews who live over the Green Line, and a whole variety of them. And I think that you can expect to see that train keep on moving. It's not going to start because of Israel applying its law. In fact, it started many years ago, and it wouldn't stop if Israel held itself back. I think that no matter what Israel does, that train is going to keep moving in that direction, at least up until the point where Israel unilaterally withdraws from all of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And I think beyond that, even if that nightmare scenario were to happen, I don't think that Israel will ever unilaterally withdraw and place Palestinians in charge of the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. And I think that even if Israel were to make such a foolish move, there would still be a demand in large parts of Europe for continued sanctions against Israel. So that we have to understand where this is, what we're talking about here. There are sanctions, there will be sanctions, and they will not be affected by the Israeli move.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Again, this was Avi Bell, professor at University of San Diego as well as Bar Ilan, an expert in international law. Thank you very much for joining me on EoZTV.
Thanks for having me.
For now, I am Elder of Zion, and we will see you again next time. Thanks. Bye. Okay, we're out. That was